August 14th, 1847. Savannah, Georgia. A woman stands on an auction block, shackles cutting into skin that bears marks no buyer wants to see. Every plantation owner in that crowd, men who've built fortunes on human suffering, refuses to bid. They turn away, whispering warnings to each other, making signs against evil. One man ignores them all. He raises his hand, calls out a price so low it's insulting, and walks away with property everyone else fears to touch. What did those experienced slavers see in her that made them believe she was worth less than nothing? And why would a wealthy plantation owner deliberately purchase what every other man in that room considered cursed? It was something far more disturbing, a systematic operation hidden behind the veneer of Southern gentility, where the screams were explained away as discipline, where disappearances were attributed to runaways, and where the truth was so monstrous that even those who suspected it chose silence over confrontation. The woman from the auction block would become the key to unraveling it all. Before we continue, subscribe to this channel and drop a comment telling us where you're watching from and what time it is there. If you want access to exclusive, uncensored videos about the world's most brutal crimes, consider becoming a member. And don't forget to hit the like button. Picture Georgia in 1847. The air hangs thick and humid, carrying the sweet rot of magnolia blossoms mixed with the acrid smell of cotton processing and human sweat. This is the Black Belt, where soil runs dark and rich, where King Cotton reigns supreme, and where fortunes are built on the backs of enslaved people who outnumber their enslavers 3-1. Savannah sits at the edge of this world, a port city where ships arrive daily from Africa and the Caribbean, where auction houses operate with the casual efficiency of livestock markets, where human beings are measured by teeth, muscle, and breeding potential. The cobblestone streets echo with carriage wheels and the chains of coffles being marched through town. Grand mansions with columned porticos stand blocks away from slave pens where men, women, and children wait in darkness to be sold. Spanish moss drapes from ancient oaks like funeral shrouds, and in the distance plantation bells ring out to control the rhythm of enslaved lives. This is a society that has convinced itself of its own righteousness, that has built an entire culture around the lie that some humans are property. The legal system protects this lie. The churches sanctify it, and men like Nathaniel Blackwood profit from it while convincing themselves they're gentlemen. Nathaniel Blackwood cut an impressive figure in Savannah society, 42 years old, impeccably dressed, educated at Princeton, a regular attendee at First Presbyterian Church. His plantation, Blackwood Manor, sprawled across 3,000 acres 15 miles inland, producing cotton that found its way to mills in Massachusetts and Liverpool. He spoke with a measured drawl, quoted Greek philosophy, and kept a library of leather-bound books that he actually read. His neighbors considered him progressive because he'd installed a small infirmary on his property and employed a doctor to tend to his slaves' ailments. He didn't use the whip himself, he had overseers for that, and he'd been known to express regret in private company about the peculiar institution's moral complexities. But here's what you need to understand about Nathaniel Blackwood. His restraint wasn't mercy, it was calculation. Every act of apparent kindness was an investment. He'd learned that healthy slaves worked harder, that a reputation for relatively humane treatment meant he could purchase slaves other planters rejected, and that maintaining a facade of decency provided perfect cover for activities that would shock even his slave-owning peers. Behind his cultivated gentleman's mask lived something far darker. A man who'd discovered that complete power over human lives could feed appetites most people don't want to acknowledge exist. Blackwood had a story that explained everything to anyone who asked questions. He ran what he called a medical plantation, a progressive experiment in slave healthcare that attracted attention from as far away as Charleston. He'd tell visitors that he purchased slaves with chronic conditions, damaged slaves, problematic slaves that other owners had given up on, and through proper medical treatment and moral instruction, he rehabilitated them into productive workers. It sounded almost humanitarian by the standards of 1847. He'd published papers in agricultural journals about treatment protocols for dysentery, malaria, and cholera. He'd hosted other plantation owners who wanted to learn his methods for reducing mortality rates and increasing work output. The infirmary was real, a clean, whitewashed building with separate rooms, proper ventilation, and medical equipment that impressed visitors. He'd even hired Dr. Marcus Thornhill, a physician from Philadelphia, who'd fallen on hard times after developing a morphine addiction, giving him a second chance at practicing medicine. To the outside world, Nathaniel Blackwood was a humane master who'd found a way to profit while appearing to care for his slaves' well-being. The local newspaper had even written an editorial praising his innovative approach to plantation management. It was the perfect cover story because it contained just enough truth to be believable and provided a logical explanation for anything unusual that might be observed. Now, I want you to picture what lay beneath that respectable surface. The infirmary had two sections, the one visitors saw and the one they didn't. Behind a locked door at the rear of the building, accessible only through a separate entrance hidden behind the smokehouse, lay 3 basement rooms that Blackwood and Dr. Thornhill called their observation chambers. These rooms were soundproofed with double walls filled with cotton batting, lit by oil lamps even in daytime, and equipped with examination tables fitted with leather restraints. Medical instruments lined the walls, some recognizable, others custom-made for purposes that had nothing to do with healing. Blackwood had constructed a separate slave quarter, isolated from the main quarters by a quarter-mile of swampland, where he housed his medical cases, slaves he'd purchased specifically because they bore marks of resistance, escape attempts, or what he called psychological abnormalities. He kept meticulous records in leather journals, documenting procedures, responses, and outcomes with scientific precision. There was a crematorium, disguised as a kiln for pottery, where evidence could be disposed of. There were storage rooms with chloroform, laudanum, and substances ordered from pharmaceutical suppliers in New York and New Orleans. And there was a network of complicit parties: the doctor, 2 overseers who'd been with Blackwood for over a decade, and a slave driver named Elijah who'd been promised his freedom in exchange for absolute loyalty and silence. Let's be real. There were signs that something wasn't right at Blackwood Plantation. Neighboring planters noticed things. Slaves purchased by Blackwood sometimes arrived at his plantation and were never seen working in the fields. When questioned, Blackwood had ready explanations. They'd died from pre-existing conditions he'd been trying to treat. They'd been too far gone for rehabilitation. They'd attempted escape and gotten lost in the swamps where alligators and disease claimed many runaways. The screams that occasionally carried from the infirmary, difficult medical procedures performed without adequate anesthesia, regrettable but sometimes necessary, the high mortality rate among his medical cases, evidence that he was taking on the hardest cases, slaves that other owners had essentially given up on. When slaves from the isolated quarters appeared changed, vacant-eyed, speaking in whispers, moving with mechanical precision, Blackwood explained it as the result of rigorous moral instruction and medical treatment breaking their rebellious spirits. He'd written extensively about the correlation between physical health and mental compliance, theories that other planters found fascinating. When supplies arrived from medical suppliers in quantities that seemed excessive, he claimed to be conducting research that would benefit the entire planter class. Every oddity had a plausible explanation rooted in his reputation as an innovative, scientifically minded plantation owner who was simply ahead of his time in understanding slave management. Dr. Marcus Thornhill was the key enabler who made everything possible. He'd arrived at Blackwood Plantation in 1844, a broken man whose morphine addiction had cost him his Philadelphia practice, his marriage, and his medical license. Blackwood offered him sanctuary, a steady supply of morphine, and the opportunity to practice medicine without oversight or accountability. In exchange, Thornhill provided medical legitimacy to whatever Blackwood wanted to do. He wrote death certificates attributing deaths to natural causes. He performed procedures that no ethical physician would consider. He kept detailed records of experiments that treated enslaved people as laboratory specimens rather than human beings. Thornhill had convinced himself he was contributing to medical science, that the knowledge gained from these unconsented procedures might eventually save lives, that his subjects were property anyway, and thus not entitled to the protections afforded to actual patients. Then there was Silas Whitmore, the head overseer, a man who'd learned that absolute power over others could satisfy urges that polite society forbade. He recruited and managed the other overseers, ensured silence through threats and bribes, and personally transported slaves to and from the hidden quarters. And Elijah, the slave driver, performed the worst of the physical work in exchange for privileges and the promise of eventual freedom. These men formed an interlocking conspiracy of self-interest, addiction, sadism, and ambition that made Blackwood's operation possible. The slaves Blackwood targeted shared specific characteristics that made them vulnerable to his particular interests. He preferred slaves who'd shown resistance, people who'd attempted escape, fought back against punishment, refused to submit psychologically, even when their bodies were broken. He purchased slaves with visible scars from punishment, slaves that auction houses marked as troublesome or rebellious, slaves whose spirits other owners had failed to break. These were people who, under different circumstances, would have been leaders, fighters, survivors. There was Thomas, a skilled blacksmith who'd tried to forge freedom papers and been caught. Sarah, a house slave who'd poisoned her master's food and survived the subsequent torture. Marcus, a field hand who'd organized a failed uprising on his previous plantation. These weren't random victims. They were specifically selected for their strength, their refusal to accept their enslavement, their humanity that stubbornly persisted despite systematic attempts to destroy it. Blackwood's twisted logic held that breaking such strong-willed individuals provided both personal satisfaction and scientific value. He believed he was documenting methods for crushing human resistance, for transforming the rebellious into the compliant, for answering the question that haunted every slaveholder. How do you destroy someone's soul while keeping their body functional enough to work? The victims shared another characteristic. They were people whose disappearance or death would raise minimal questions because they'd already been marked as problems by the slave system itself. Her name was Ruth, though at the Savannah auction she'd been listed only as female, approximately 28, scarred, potentially dangerous. She stood on that auction block with marks covering her back, arms, and legs, some from whippings, some from brandings, some from injuries sustained during escape attempts. The scars told a story of sustained resistance across multiple plantations. She'd run 5 times, been caught and punished 5 times, and after the 5th attempt, her previous owner decided she was more trouble than she was worth. But here's what made experienced slavers refuse to bid on her. Ruth had a reputation. Word traveled through the auction houses about slaves who couldn't be broken, who infected others with ideas of freedom, who caused more problems than their labor was worth. 3 overseers had requested transfers rather than continue dealing with her. 2 house slaves had attempted escape after befriending her. She had a way of looking at white men, not with hatred, which they expected and could punish, but with a clear-eyed assessment that suggested she saw through all their justifications and found them wanting. That look, more than the scars, more than the escape attempts, made her dangerous. Nathaniel Blackwood saw her and recognized exactly what she was, a perfect subject, someone whose breaking would be particularly satisfying, someone who would test his methods to their limits, someone whose spirit was strong enough that destroying it would represent a real achievement. He bid $30, an insult price that acknowledged she was damaged goods, and led her away in chains. Ruth arrived at Blackwood Plantation expecting the familiar horrors of slavery, the labor, the punishment, the dehumanization she'd experienced since being captured in Sierra Leone 14 years earlier. What she found was something different. For the first week, she was kept in the main slave quarters, observed but not put to work. She received adequate food, basic medical attention for old injuries, and was assigned to light tasks that seemed designed to assess her physical capabilities. Then, on the 8th night, 2 overseers came for her. They brought her to the hidden infirmary entrance, downstairs that descended into lamp-lit rooms that smelled of chemicals and fear. Dr. Thornhill was there, examining instruments. Blackwood was there, watching with interest. And for the next 6 hours, Ruth experienced procedures that she would later struggle to describe because the English she'd learned as a slave lacked words for what they did. They measured pain tolerance. They tested responses to various chemical compounds. They documented how long consciousness could be maintained under different conditions. And through it all, Blackwood asked questions about her resistance, her escape attempts, her refusal to submit, as if her trauma was data to be collected. When they returned her to the isolated quarters before dawn, she was physically intact, but fundamentally altered. The other slaves there, 9 men and women in various states of dissociation, moved like automatons and spoke in whispers. They'd learned that survival meant silence, that even acknowledging what happened in the basement brought you back there sooner. Now you have to understand, there was technically oversight of plantation operations in Georgia, but it was designed to protect slaveholders' property rights, not enslaved people's lives. When a slave died, the owners simply recorded the death in their plantation records and buried the body. No investigation occurred unless another white person filed a complaint. The county sheriff, Thomas Garrett, did ride out to Blackwood Plantation twice in 1846 after receiving anonymous letters suggesting improprieties. Both times, Blackwood welcomed him warmly, provided a tour of the public areas, showed him healthy slaves working in fields, introduced him to Dr. Thornhill, who explained the medical plantation concept, and offered dinner and whiskey. Garrett saw a well-run plantation with better conditions than most. He noted in his report that while Blackwood's mortality rates were higher than average, this was attributable to his practice of purchasing already compromised slaves for rehabilitation. The anonymous letters were dismissed as coming from jealous competitors or abolition sympathizers trying to cause trouble. There was a second inquiry after a slave who'd been sold to Blackwood was later claimed by family members in Savannah who'd been working to purchase his freedom. When they came looking for him, they were told he'd died of pneumonia within 3 weeks of arrival. Dr. Thornhill provided a death certificate. Blackwood expressed sympathy and explained that the slave's previous untreated illnesses had been too advanced. The family suspected foul play, but had no standing to demand an investigation. They were free black people, and their word against a white plantation owner meant nothing in Georgia courts. The slaves in the isolated quarters were living evidence of what Blackwood's methods could achieve and what they'd lost in the process. There was Benjamin, who'd arrived 6 months before Ruth, a man who'd once led singing in the fields, who'd kept spirits up with stories and jokes, who'd been known for his quick wit and infectious laugh. Now he moved with mechanical precision, spoke only when directly addressed, and performed tasks with perfect obedience while his eyes remained vacant. His body functioned, but his personality had been extinguished. There was Elizabeth, who'd been a healer and midwife, respected by other slaves for her knowledge of herbs and birthing practices. She now sat for hours without moving, startling at sudden sounds, and seemed unable to form complete sentences. She'd scream sometimes in the night, then fall silent mid-scream, as if someone had cut the sound off. There was Daniel, whose hands shook constantly despite being only 23 years old, who flinched from any sudden movement, who'd developed a stutter that made every word a struggle. These weren't people who'd been simply whipped into submission. Plenty of slaves bore the scars of brutal punishment, but maintained their inner selves. These were people who'd been systematically dismantled at the psychological level, whose sense of self had been deliberately attacked and partially destroyed. When Ruth looked at them, she understood that this was Blackwood's true purpose, not just controlling bodies, but annihilating souls. And she understood that she was intended to become like them. This is where the story gets truly chilling, because Blackwood's methods weren't random sadism. They were systematic, documented, and refined over time. He developed what he considered a scientific protocol for breaking human resistance based on sleep deprivation, sensory manipulation, chemical intervention, and psychological torture. Subjects were kept in the basement for 72-hour cycles, with lights that stayed on constantly to prevent circadian rhythm stability. They were given laudanum in doses calculated to create dependency while avoiding overdose. They were subjected to procedures that inflicted pain without causing visible external injuries, internal examinations with instruments, pressure point manipulation, exposure to extreme temperatures. Blackwood documented everything in his journals: pain thresholds, response times, the precise moment when psychological resistance began to crack. He developed isolation techniques, keeping subjects in total darkness for days, then sudden bright light. He used white noise to prevent sleep, then sudden silence that was somehow worse. He discovered that hope was the most important thing to destroy. He'd offer release dates that would never come, promise better treatment that never materialized. play elaborate psychological games that left subjects unable to trust their own perceptions. Dr. Thornhill provided the medical knowledge, understanding of pain pathways, chemical effects on the brain, the physical limits of human endurance. Between them, they'd created a systematic approach to destroying a person's psychological autonomy while keeping their body functional enough to work. Let me tell you about Samuel Hayes, not a hero by design, but a man who stumbled into moral clarity despite every incentive to look away. Samuel was an overseer on the neighboring Davidson Plantation, 28 years old, born in North Carolina to a family of small farmers who'd never owned slaves. He drifted into overseer work because it paid better than farmhand wages and required no capital investment. He told himself he was just managing laborers, that his job was organizing work rather than inflicting punishment, that he was actually protecting the slaves by being less brutal than other overseers might be. This was the lie he lived with. Samuel was literate, detail-oriented, and troubled by what he called the moral questions around slavery. He'd seen Frederick Douglass speak in Baltimore before moving south, and though he dismissed the abolitionist arguments as impractical, they'd planted doubts he couldn't fully uproot. He drank too much whiskey most nights to quiet thoughts he didn't want to examine. He'd lost a sister to fever when she was 12, and something about that loss had left him unable to fully dismiss others' suffering the way most overseers did. In October 1847, Davidson sent Samuel to Blackwood Plantation to borrow a specialized cotton gin part and discuss purchasing some of Blackwood's rehabilitated slaves. That visit would force Samuel to confront truths he'd been carefully avoiding and make a choice that would cost him everything he had. Samuel arrived at Blackwood Plantation on an October afternoon when Spanish moss dripped with recent rain and fog crept through the pine forests. He found Blackwood cordial and welcoming, discussing business while showing him the main facilities. But Samuel noticed things that didn't add up. There were separate quarters visible in the distance that Blackwood diverted him from visiting. There were sounds from the infirmary that didn't match the explanation of routine medical care, a cry that was cut off too suddenly, footsteps that moved with urgency, the smell of something chemical and wrong. That evening, Blackwood invited Samuel to stay for dinner and overnight, as the fog made travel dangerous. After dinner, after Blackwood retired to his study, Samuel found himself unable to sleep. The whiskey he'd drunk made him brave and stupid in equal measure. He slipped out of the guest room and began wandering the plantation grounds. He approached the isolated quarters and heard weeping from inside, not the crying of physical pain, but the broken sobbing of someone whose spirit was tearing apart. He moved toward the infirmary and found the hidden entrance partially ajar, and he descended those stairs into lamp-lit horror. He saw the examination tables, the restraints, the instruments, the journals lying open with their detailed documentation of experiments. He saw chemical supplies labeled with purposes that had nothing to do with healing. And then he heard voices, Blackwood and Thornhill discussing tomorrow's protocols. And he understood with absolute clarity that he was looking at evidence of systematic torture disguised as medical treatment. I need to pause here for a moment and ask you directly, can you handle what comes next? Because this is where the story turns truly chilling, where we move from understanding that something evil was happening to confronting the specific details of what that evil looked like. This is the point where many people want to look away, to tell themselves that humans aren't capable of this level of calculated cruelty, that civilization prevents such horrors. But the truth is that civilization often provides the perfect cover for atrocity: institutions, professional credentials, legal systems that protect power. What Samuel discovered in those basement rooms was evil enabled by education, facilitated by medicine, protected by law. If you're ready to continue, I need you to stay with me. Drop a comment if you're still watching. Share this video if you think others need to know this history, because the only thing more dangerous than remembering atrocities is forgetting they happened. Samuel stood frozen at the bottom of those stairs, his mind struggling to process what his eyes confirmed. The journals contained detailed records dating back 3 years, names, dates, procedures, outcomes. He recognized some names from slaves he'd seen sold at Savannah auctions, There were anatomical drawings depicting internal organs, pain responses, the effects of various chemical compounds on human subjects. There were notes about psychological breaking points, about how long it took to destroy someone's will to resist, about which combination of techniques produced the most complete submission. And there were photographs, daguerreotypes that Blackwood had commissioned from a traveling photographer in Savannah who had been paid handsomely to ask no questions. Images of slaves in various states of physical and psychological deterioration, documented like botanical specimens. Samuel tore pages from one journal and stuffed them into his jacket, his hands shaking so badly he could barely grip the paper. He took 3 daguerreotypes, small enough to conceal. He was backing toward the stairs when he heard footsteps above. Blackwood and Thornhill were descending, their voices discussing a subject scheduled for tomorrow's session. Samuel had seconds to make a decision. He extinguished the lamp nearest him, pressed himself into the shadow behind a storage cabinet, and held his breath while the 2 men entered the room, walked past him within 3 feet, and began arranging instruments for their next subject. He waited until they were absorbed in their preparations, then crept up the stairs, praying every board wouldn't creak and betray him. Samuel made it to the main house and grabbed his coat, but his absence from the guest room hadn't gone unnoticed. Silas Whitmore, the overseer, had seen lamplight in the infirmary basement and gone to investigate. He found muddy footprints on the stairs, footprints that didn't match Blackwood's or Thornhill's boots. By the time Samuel was mounting his horse, Whitmore was raising the alarm. Blackwood emerged from the infirmary with cold fury. He understood immediately what Samuel had discovered and what it meant. He sent Whitmore and 2 other overseers in pursuit with explicit instructions. Bring Samuel back alive if possible, but dead if necessary, and recover whatever evidence he'd taken. Samuel had a 5-minute head start, but he was riding an unfamiliar horse through fog-shrouded darkness on plantation roads he barely knew. Behind him, he heard shouts and the pounding of hooves. He abandoned the main road and plunged into pine forest, branches whipping his face, his horse stumbling over unseen roots. A gunshot cracked through the fog, too close. He reached a creek and urged his horse into the water, hoping to obscure his trail, then emerged on the far bank and rode hard toward the Davidson plantation. Another gunshot, and his horse screamed and went down, a bullet through its flank. Samuel rolled clear, scrambled to his feet, and ran on foot through the forest. He could hear the pursuers behind him, spreading out, calling to each other. He fell twice, came up muddy and bleeding, kept running. And then he saw lamplight ahead, the edge of Davidson Plantation, and he ran toward it like salvation itself. Samuel burst into the Davidson Plantation house at 3 in the morning, wild-eyed and mud-covered, demanding to see Mr. Davidson immediately. He poured out his story to Davidson and his wife, showing them the stolen journal pages and daguerreotypes. He expected immediate action, righteous outrage, a ride to fetch the sheriff at dawn. Instead, he was met with uncomfortable silence. Davidson examined the evidence, then looked at Samuel with something like pity. "You've stolen a man's property records," Davidson said slowly. "Broken into his facility, taken private documents and photographs. What you're describing, even if it's all true, isn't illegal. They're his slaves. He can do with them as he sees fit under Georgia law." Samuel felt the ground shift beneath him. "But the torture, the experiments, is none of our business," Mrs. Davidson interrupted. "And even if someone were inclined to make it their business, what you've done, trespassing, theft, makes you the criminal here." There was a knock at the door. Blackwood had arrived, with Sheriff Garrett and 2 deputies. He'd ridden to town immediately, reported a burglary and assault by a trusted overseer who'd apparently suffered a mental breakdown. He expressed concern for Samuel's well-being, suggested he needed medical attention for what was clearly a disturbed mental state. And when the sheriff asked to see what Samuel had stolen, Davidson handed over the journal pages and daguerreotypes without hesitation, returning stolen property to its rightful owner. Blackwood thanked him graciously, then turned to Samuel with eyes that held no mercy whatsoever. But here's where the story takes an unexpected turn. Ruth, the woman from the auction block, had been watching and listening from the isolated quarters. She'd seen Samuel's nighttime investigation. She'd heard the pursuit and the gunshots. and she understood that someone had finally discovered what was happening, and that discovery was being buried. Over the next 3 days, while Samuel sat in a Savannah jail cell charged with theft and trespassing, Ruth made a decision that would cost her everything but might save others. She knew the basement protocols, the schedule, when the guards were changed, when Blackwood and Thornhill were distracted. She organized the 9 other slaves in the isolated quarters, the broken, traumatized people who'd been experimented on, and made them understand. This was their only chance. On the 4th night after Samuel's arrest, while Blackwood was in Savannah meeting with his lawyer, Ruth led a rebellion. They overpowered the single guard at the isolated quarters, took his keys, and freed themselves. But instead of running, Ruth led them to the main slave quarters and freed everyone there. 63 enslaved people who suddenly faced a choice between familiar horror and uncertain freedom. Then Ruth did something extraordinary. She and 6 others barricaded themselves inside the infirmary basement with evidence that couldn't be denied: the journals, the instruments, the chemical supplies, and sent word to every plantation in the county that they would burn it all unless authorities came to witness what Blackwood had been doing. The standoff lasted 36 hours and attracted attention from neighboring counties, newspaper reporters from Savannah, and finally, federal authorities who happened to be in Georgia investigating rumors of illegal slave trading from Africa. What they found in that basement couldn't be explained away as routine plantation discipline. The journals contained detailed documentation of systematic torture stretching back 3 years, describing procedures that violated every standard of medical ethics and human decency. The daguerreotypes showed enslaved people in various states of physical and psychological deterioration, their suffering carefully documented like scientific specimens. The instruments included devices designed specifically for inflicting pain without leaving external marks. Chemical supplies included experimental compounds obtained from pharmaceutical suppliers in the North, who'd had no idea what purposes their products would serve. And there were the living witnesses, 10 enslaved people bearing physical and psychological scars from Blackwood's experiments, whose testimony corroborated every horrifying detail. Blackwood's carefully constructed facade crumbled under scrutiny. His educational credentials were real, but his Princeton dissertation had been on property management theory. He'd taught himself medical knowledge through journals and correspondence, conducting experiments on enslaved people to test theories no legitimate physician would consider. Dr. Thornhill's morphine addiction was worse than anyone knew. He was barely functional, performing procedures while intoxicated, his medical judgment completely compromised. And Silas Whitmore, the overseer, had a criminal history in Virginia that Blackwood had concealed, including suspected involvement in the death of 2 slaves on a previous plantation. Let's be real about how deep this went. As authorities dug deeper into Blackwood's records, they discovered he wasn't working in isolation. He'd been corresponding with physicians and researchers in Europe who were conducting similar experiments, sharing findings and methodologies through coded letters routed through medical societies. There was a physician in London experimenting with pain tolerance limits on Irish prisoners. There was a researcher in Paris studying psychological breaking points using inmates from asylums. There was a network of plantation owners across Georgia, South Carolina, and Louisiana who'd purchased Blackwood's rehabilitated slaves and reported back on their long-term compliance, essentially participating in extended studies without fully understanding what they were validating. Blackwood had also been supplying specimens to medical schools. He'd shipped bodies of deceased slaves to anatomy programs in Philadelphia and New York, claiming they were paupers or criminals, but actually sending evidence of his experiments to unwitting medical students who learned from the corpses of torture victims. The pharmaceutical suppliers who'd sold him chemicals had accepted his credentials and orders without investigating how experimental compounds were being used. This wasn't just one monster on one plantation. It was a transnational system that treated enslaved people as experimental subjects whose suffering could be rationalized as contributing to medical knowledge. The network included respectable institutions, educated professionals, and legitimate businesses who'd convinced themselves they were participating in science rather than atrocity. Now you have to understand, the real conspiracy wasn't just the people directly involved. It was the entire society that had created conditions where such horrors could occur without intervention. Neighboring planters had heard rumors about Blackwood's operation for years, but chose to dismiss them because investigating would mean acknowledging uncomfortable truths about their own plantation's practices. The sheriff had received multiple anonymous complaints, but couldn't conceive that an educated gentleman like Blackwood could be doing anything truly wrong. The category of gentleman and torturer couldn't coexist in his mind. The medical establishment refused to acknowledge Thornhill's crimes because doing so would mean confronting how medical knowledge had been acquired through unconsented experiments on vulnerable populations throughout history. The churches remained silent because admitting this level of evil within their congregations would undermine their theological justifications for slavery itself. The newspapers initially tried to suppress the story because it threatened economic interests. Plantation agriculture sustained the entire regional economy, and exposing systematic torture might embolden abolitionists and threaten the institution that kept profits flowing. Even after evidence became undeniable, there were attempts to minimize the scope, to present Blackwood as an isolated aberration rather than a symptom of a system built on dehumanization. The conspiracy of silence extended from individuals who'd witnessed oddities and said nothing, to institutions that actively worked to contain and control information that might destabilize the entire social order of the antebellum South. Here's what happened to everyone involved. Nathaniel Blackwood was arrested and charged with theft of property belonging to other owners. Not for torturing his own slaves, which was legal, but for conducting experiments on slaves he'd effectively stolen by lying about their deaths to previous owners. The legal system still struggled to conceive of crimes against enslaved people as actual crimes. He was convicted and sentenced to 15 years in prison, but died of fever in his cell after 18 months, maintaining his innocence to the end and insisting his methods would eventually be vindicated by science. Dr. Marcus Thornhill was found dead from a morphine overdose in his room the night before he was scheduled to testify. The investigation ruled it suicide, though some suspected murder, to prevent him from revealing additional names. Silas Whitmore fled Georgia before arrest and was never apprehended, likely living under an assumed identity somewhere in the Western Territories. Samuel Hayes was released from jail once evidence confirmed his claims, but he couldn't continue as an overseer. No plantation would hire him after he'd betrayed another white man to save slaves. He moved north to Ohio and became involved in underground railroad operations, dedicating his remaining years to helping people escape the system he'd once enforced. Ruth survived the standoff and was technically freed when federal authorities determined that Blackwood's operation violated interstate commerce laws related to slave trading. She remained in Savannah, working as a laundress, and spent decades documenting the stories of enslaved people for abolition societies. She lived to see the Emancipation Proclamation, dying in 1869 at approximately 50 years old. Her testimony became part of the documentary evidence used by abolitionists to expose slavery's horrors. The legacy of what happened at Blackwood Plantation extends far beyond 1847. The journals and evidence recovered from the basement survived and were used by abolition societies to counter arguments that slavery was a benign institution. The case became a rallying point for anti-slavery activists who could point to documented atrocities that couldn't be dismissed as abolitionist exaggeration. But here's the uncomfortable truth. Blackwood's methods weren't aberrations. They were extensions of logic already embedded in a system that treated humans as property. If enslaved people were property, then owners could do anything with them. The systematic torture was shocking, but the legal slavery that enabled it was normalized. The moral lesson isn't just that individuals can be monsters, it's that entire societies can construct legal and cultural frameworks that enable monstrous behavior while allowing participants to see themselves as civilized. The doctors, lawyers, sheriffs, and neighbors who enabled or ignored Blackwood's operation weren't all sadists. Many were ordinary people who'd accepted a system that required them to view enslaved people as less than human. The real horror is how easily atrocity becomes routine when it's sanctioned by law, rationalized by science and protected by social structures that benefit from not looking too closely. Ruth's courage in forcing society to witness what it had been ignoring represents a pattern that would repeat throughout history. Oppressed people having to risk everything to make their suffering visible to those who preferred comfortable ignorance. The Blackwood case reminds us that evil doesn't always announce itself with obvious cruelty. Sometimes it wears respectable clothes, quotes philosophy, and hides behind professional credentials and institutional authority.